Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's episode is titled Letters from an American, and we're joined by Heather Cox-Richardson. Today is no joke, April 1st, 2021. My name is Andy Mink. I am the Vice President of Education at the Center, and I want to welcome you to the program tonight on behalf of my staff, Libby and Mike, as well as our graduate student interns, Hannah and Carly and Josh. This is, I think, probably the spring break episode for many of you. We appreciate you joining us when you've had some time to rest and recover this week leading up to the Easter weekend. For those of you who have a spring break scheduled for next week, we appreciate you getting through that last little bit of a slog in your school calendar. In particular, I want to thank some new guests that we have tonight. It's really great to see Melanie here. Melanie's here from Noble Avenue Elementary School. Krista's here from Palisades Charter Elementary School. It's always nice to have teachers and educators from the K-5 grade levels join us for these conversations. And of course, it's our goal to provide really concise and clear conversation that can then be used as you consider maybe not instruction, but certainly conversation in the way you interact with your students. It's also nice to see on the other end of the spectrum, Kathleen and Melody, both from nearby universities here in Central North Carolina. Melody's from NC State, and Kathleen is checked in from Duke University. It's nice to have, again, such a broad span. Jen's with us tonight from Loris, South Carolina, Christina from Hingham High School, and if you squint really hard, you'll see Maggie down there on the coast of North Carolina with her feet up, enjoying a drink, enjoying the conversation tonight. We appreciate her being here, as well as her daughters who are just outside of Atlanta. I hope Teresa and Monica are with us as well. Again, it's always nice to have such a large audience join us and for the conversation to be really representative of the full span of educators and those interested in the humanities. In some ways, I think that audience then, the folks that are in the room with you tonight, is a good reflection of the National Humanities Center. And I think most, if not all, of the scholars and the fellows that come and spend a year with us in fellowship have very much the same purpose and intent in their lives, the passion in their lives that our guest Heather Richardson tonight has, and that is they're working really hard to make sense of complicated issues, to take a long view, to take an evidence-based approach, or to take a really tight micro view of things that help us understand the human condition. While they're experts and they have all done a life's work in the body of scholarship and disciplines that they work in, the fact is it's not easy. It's not easy when they emerge or they talk, as we will tonight, with authority and expertise and experience. It takes a lot of hard work. And so hopefully what we'll do tonight is make that process visible and to try to, if not condense, at least share an approach of the ways that we can start to look for clues in the past, clues in the context, and ways that we relate to each other to help better understand these questions. I do appreciate all of you dropping your questions in the chat box. I hope we get to some of them tonight. I'm not sure if we can get to all of them. In fact, I think many of you asked some really existential questions that we could probably do a full webinar on, as it turns out. I hope you have had the chance to go back to the digital library. I've been dropping some links in during the audience chat, and in particular, review the associated group with tonight's session. There you'll find not only links to resources and readings that have been compiled by Professor Richardson, as well as our TA, Lindsay Sharon, but it's a place where you can start to see the kinds of resources that you can then use in your instruction and then use to take this conversation to your classroom. Some of those may include specific examples that Heather and Lindsay have shared. Others might include other resources from other events and activities and organizations. For example, we did a great webinar last spring with Penn State historian, he's not at Penn State, where is he, Heather? With Kevin Cruz on the role of historians in social media. If you start to search and use the keyword function, you'll find many other free and open resources that allow you to, again, assemble that context, assemble that evidence from the digital library. We're really pleased to have such a large number of credible and high quality organizations contributing. Again, all of these materials are free and open. They also can be attached integrated directly to your Google Classroom. So if you're teaching virtually, or if you've got some kind of learning management system that provides your students with prompts or with materials to review or perhaps formative assessments, you can use the unique links of all the resources in the library in that fashion. As it turns out, we've only got 8 more evenings after tonight to spend together. They include some really top-notch webinar speakers and topics. I do hope that you review the remaining sessions and sign up if you haven't already. I'm particularly interested in you joining us for next Wednesday's session with Michelle Zimmerman. This is the first event of a 3-week series of events on artificial intelligence and the way that the humanities can help us understand the impact and the efficacy of AI as we use it in teaching and in our life. That night will be specifically focused on artificial intelligence in the classroom, but I'd also encourage you to look at the other free virtual activities that we have lined up throughout the month of April that bring scholars and humanists and experts to discuss what I find to be really compelling issues like privacy and morality and ethics and art and writing in the artificial intelligence context. All of our webinars do earn you 5 professional development credits, and you'll receive certification at the conclusion of tonight's session. If you don't receive them, as every single session somebody doesn't get a document, please just forward your email to me or to Libby, and we'll be sure to take care of that. Or if you're getting to the end of the year and you really do want to accrue some more professional credit, I would encourage you to take a look at our online course selection. All 12 courses are designed to, just as our webinars do, introduce you to scholars and scholarship to explore complicated issues and topics. For example, Understanding the Modern Middle East is one of our most popular courses at this point, and it does earn you 35 professional credit hours. For all you LA folks, that does count for salary credit. I want to thank our Teacher Advisory Council as we near the end of this year for all of their hard work this year. I also want to encourage many of you in the room tonight to consider applying for next year's cohort. Application process is currently open and we'll be accepting applications until May the 3rd. You'll notice in the application process that we do ask for a letter of support from your administrator or someone in a supervisory role. Again, that's not necessarily to get a better sense of you, although it's helpful, but it's also to put your school on notice that we will be inviting you to join us at the center in North Carolina in the fall. And I don't want anybody's principal to come back and say that they hadn't approved the substitute teacher yet. Tonight's session is an audio and PowerPoint webinar, which means while there's no video component, you do have a very active role to play. That's in the audience chat, in which many of you are using it already. It's also in the Ask Professor Richardson tab. If you have a more formal question that you'd like for me to bring to the conversation, I'd be happy to do so. If for some reason you lose your internet or your audio starts to warble, or if things just don't seem to be going as smoothly as you would like, don't forget to make sure that the tabs at the top are selected to slides. Also make sure that your volume is at an adequate level so you can hear what we're saying. Worst case scenario, I wish it wasn't voodoo like this, but worst case scenario, either refresh your page or in some extreme cases, log out and come right back in. It will not disrupt your documentation of attendance. Again, you've joined us tonight for Letters from an American with Heather Cox Richardson. She's a professor of history and also the author of a daily newsletter and blog and Facebook feed and Twitter feed of the same name, Letters from an American. We're joined also tonight by Lindsay Sharon. Lindsay is a middle school teacher at Ensign Intermediate School in Newport Beach, California. Lindsay, like myself, has received her 2nd dose just recently, and so I'm super glad she's here. She's going to be dropping links and questions and thoughts in the chat box. Please do lean on her if you have questions you'd like to ask in the sidebar. So with that, Heather, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself and join me at the front of the room, and I want to thank you for joining us all the way from somewhere in Maine.
It's a pleasure to be here, Andy. Thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for showing up tonight.
It took a special guest speaker like yourself to entice teachers to join us on spring break, and I'm glad that you have as well. Heather, before we start, and before I invite you to start forwarding through your slides and leading the conversation, I would like to begin with a question of my own, if you don't mind. I suspect that you're somebody who wins all the arguments at Thanksgiving now. You've been doing this newsletter consistently on a daily basis. Many of the attendees in our audience probably subscribe. If they don't, they will after tonight. I do. I get it every morning when I wake up. It reminds me a little bit of a weekly supplement to the newspaper called written by Betty Debnam Hunt, called the Mini Page. And I distinctly remember as a kid it arriving every Monday morning in my elementary school class. And Betty, starting in 1967, produced this insert that would explain the news to kids. And she would handwrite it and hand draw it. Did it for 38 years. I had the pleasure of getting to know her before she passed last fall. She lived in Raleigh. And I talked to her a lot about the sheer stamina that it takes to do that on a daily basis. Heather, how in the world do you do it? Every single day? Are you kidding me?
Well, I'm still frozen back here at the idea of 38 years. I don't remember that particular publication, and it sounds really impressive. I don't know the answer to that. I never intended to start doing this, and I guess maybe it's that the world has been so confusing that it doesn't make any sense to me either. So if I don't make sense of it for myself, I can't sleep. So I might as well make sense of it for myself and for everybody else as well. But it definitely takes a toll. I'm not going to be doing it for any 38 years. I'll tell you that.
Well, Betty would probably have said the same when her 38 years concluded and she sold it to syndication. But I think it does speak, and I appreciate the answer that you gave, because there are things now that keep us up at night. And I suspect that people have always lived in complicated, confusing times. People always didn't know what was happening when they put their feet on the floor in the morning. But with the internet and with the information deluge we have, it seems to be more of an issue. Do you find that to be the case? Does your mind just spin more than it may have 20 years ago?
Well, actually, yes, but I think the difference for me is that when we read the news nowadays, I always feel like it's extraordinarily shallow. Like they will introduce a topic as if you know about it. And you're sitting there going, wait a minute, I've taught American history for 30 years. I have never heard of this. Where on earth is this coming from? And maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like the older generation of newscasters had enough background that they would explain, what the beginning of the Civil War in a country was, or, what some specific law meant, or, budget reconciliation, where did that come from? So you felt like your feet were a little bit more under you. But I always sort of feel when I watch the TV news or when I read most stories, some newspapers are now better than others. I sort of feel like I'm walking into a soap opera without any sense of who any of the characters are. And so that's kind of what I try and do every week for people, is just sort of to say, hey, wait a minute, let's take a look and see, something beneath the surface of the puddle here, and get down a little bit and see where the past is. And at least I felt as a child, when you watched the news, you had a better sense, for example, of the movement of troops across Vietnam, in a way that nowadays I just feel like we don't get very well in America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point, and I think being able to address that as a humanist, as an historian, and what you really sound like as an educator is going to make tonight's conversation really fascinating. So again, thank you for joining us and indulging me in the first couple of questions. But what I'll do as the moderator is to bring questions from the audience as they emerge. We'll sort of intertwine those with what you'll share with us tonight, and we'll go from there.
Well, the fact you mentioned education is not an accident. There is absolutely no question that what I do is basically to bring the skills of an educator to a national audience. And this is one of the ways I think that we are going to need to rethink education going forward, at least at the national level. Because one of the mistakes people make is they think that somehow I have produced this letter, and I really didn't. In the same way that when you're a teacher in a classroom, you certainly prepare material, but you're responding to your students and you're responding to what they need to know, and it's part of a bigger conversation, and that is 100% the vibe behind the Letters from an American. So would you like me to start going through the slides?
Yeah, I think so. Go ahead and start to unpack this for us. And again, there may be times where I interject, but we would love to hear how you share this with us.
So I'm not. Oh yes, I figured out how I can do it. Welcome everybody. And when the National Humanities Center asked me to do this today, they asked me to talk about Letters from an American, and I have not ever really talked about it before. So it's been very interesting to actually go back over it and think about what somebody might want to know about it. And I realized, I was just out walking, and I realized that it's an interesting day for me to do it, because sort of one of the reasons everything has developed in the last year is that I actually came out with a book a year ago today. And a lot of what's happened around the Letters from an American has to do with that book that came out. But I started here with a picture of a Yellowjacket, because I privately call the Letters from an American the Yellowjacket Chronicles. And that's because I was painting my house and getting ready to move and to move into a new place on September 15th, 2019, when I got stung by a yellow jacket. And I'm allergic to yellow jackets, and I did not have my EpiPen with me, and I live in quite a rural area. And I was with my brother-in-law, and it's sort of a miracle I'm still alive, because he took one look at what had happened, and he said, "I'm going to run and get your EpiPen." And I got a look on my face, and I said, "Oh, Chris." And he said, "Is it in your car? I'll run into your car and get it." And I'm like, "Oh, you're really not going to hear this." And the look on his face when he turned around and said, "You don't have your EpiPen, do you?" Probably should have melted me where I stood. But what happened was, because I had been stung, I didn't dare to get in my car and drive to Massachusetts until I knew how bad my reaction was going to be. And so I sat down and I wrote on Facebook. I had been writing on Facebook for years about once a week sort of essays on one thing or another, and I hadn't written since July 18th. So I sat down to write about what I saw, and I did a retrospective of what I thought had happened in America since July 18th. So between July 18th and September 15th of 2019, and what the Trump administration looked to me at that time. And people started writing very, very quickly to ask questions about that, because I had called out the fact that we had just seen a letter from, on Friday the 13th, from Adam Schiff at the head of the House Intelligence Committee to then acting Director of National Intelligence McGuire, saying, "We know you're withholding a whistleblower complaint, and the fact you're withholding it is against the law, and the fact that you are withholding it suggests that it's about somebody really important, so you better hand that sucker over." And I paraphrase, he didn't say that sucker, but he actually accused a member of the executive branch of breaking a specific law, and that had not happened before. So I put that in the piece I wrote on the 15th, and people started asking me all kinds of questions about it. And I thought, I'm not really sure I should answer again, because I tried to never write more than once a week, because I thought it would bore people. And I remember sitting there thinking, should I really answer again? So not on the 15th, but on the 17th, I wrote again, and then more and more questions poured in. So then I think it was on the 19th, I wrote again, and then I started doing it every day, and I've done it every single day since. Although I realized, at some point I'll show you, I realized that people needed a break, and I will tell you how things happened from there. But so I call it the Yellowjacket Chronicles, but as I said before, I want to emphasize that they are 100% not about me. The letters, I am translating for the classroom the same way that educators are talking to their students and interacting with their students. And I'm showing you now. Andy had asked me to go ahead and do pictures, and since it's very much a verbal medium, that's a little bit difficult. But what you're seeing in front of you now is one of the things that has really jumped out at me since I started doing the letters, and that is the extraordinary talent that we have in this country. So I'm showing you some of the artwork of some of my top readers. And one of them is an elderly woman who takes extraordinary pictures of insects. Another woman does all of her own house building. She's not a contractor, but she does it all. So these shelves here are her latest project. There's photographers, as you can see with this image from, I believe it's Canada. And then bakers who did, for example, the pies for Pie Day. And then that vase is actually made by, again, one of my readers. And these are people you're passing on the street and not recognizing how extraordinarily talented they are. And so one of the things that's really important, I think, about the letters is the degree to which they have been organic and the degree to which they are really indicative of where the mind of America is and what people really want to know about and want to hear about. So when I started writing, again, I'm literally only reacting to what people were asking me in the chat, in comments, in all kinds of things. I'm just a college professor who happens to have a Facebook page, a professional Facebook page, and I'd written. I was just finishing my 6th book. I mean, it's not like I didn't have a public presence. I wrote for the New York Times and the Washington Post and a lot of other places, but it was actually very easy for me once I started, because if you remember 2019, things happened really fast, really hard, and really fast. So we started with that whistleblower complaint, and you may or may not remember this, but and I only remember it because I went after Andy asked me to do this presentation. I actually went back and read a bunch of the early stuff. You just forget a lot of it. And the whistleblower stuff fell like dominoes. It was like bang, bang, bang. Every day I'd go, wait a minute, it's been another huge day. And I would just sort of say, this is what happened. Here are the players. Here's why this matters. And so we started with the whistleblower, and then all the pieces that fell about that. And then it turned out that then President Trump had called the newly elected president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, and just so you know, I am so tired of spelling certain names that all the Vladimirs and Volodymyrs and all the people from Ukraine and Russia have driven me nuts. I can now differentiate all of their spellings, but the other one that has driven me absolutely insane is Giuliani, because I always type the vowels in the wrong letter. And one of the things that made me happiest about the election of Joe Biden was the realization that I might not have to type Giuliani any longer. So that happened very quickly. And then you may or may not remember this. That was in September. And then in October of 2019, we extraordinarily abruptly pulled out of Northern Syria. And the pullout from Northern Syria was a really huge deal because, of course, we abandoned our allies, the Kurds, and our bases got taken over very quickly by the Russians. There were massacres, quite poignant massacres of our former allies, and it was really unclear what was happening because the White House was saying, oh, we're pulling troops out, but they weren't pulling troops out. They were simply moving the troops somewhere else. And so there was that came up, and then we got into impeachment. And I've given you a picture here of Alexander Vindman, who of course testified so powerfully in the impeachment hearings. But the whole point of this is from the late 2019, there was just one piece of brand new information after another every single night. So the letters really got established quickly because so many people just didn't know what was happening. And then right on the heels of the impeachment and the acquittal of Trump in the impeachment, we hit coronavirus. So then all of a sudden that happened, and then of course 2020 happened, and believe me, I never intended to write these letters, but that's where they came from. But anyway, so that was the pattern of the how the letters got started and why I call them the Yellowjacket Chronicles, because the fact that Yellowjacket decided on September 15th, and mind you, I wasn't doing anything to bother it. I was literally standing in my lawn, not surrounded by anything else, and it flew over and stung me. I've always sort of considered that, the world was waking me up to say, you better start writing. But one of the things that happened quickly was I realized completely inadvertently, it was in the spring of 2020, that people were overwhelmed. And that making sense of the news every day helped me sleep. People needed a break. And I discovered this because right before coronavirus hit, my partner and I were hiking in the Southwest, and I was still writing every night. And there was one night that I was absolutely exhausted, and we'd been in Zion, and I had just started my new book, actually, and the one I'm working on now. And I happened to take the image that I'm showing you here. As I say, Andy asked me to do pictures, and there are a lot when you write letters. And And I said, I'm too tired. I can still remember I'm in this hotel room, I guess in Utah, and I said, I'm just too tired to write. I'm really sorry. It's been a busy day for news, but I just can't do anything. So here's a picture I took. And I went to bed, and people swarmed it. They were like, this is great. This is beautiful. You know, we're so happy to see something other than the news. And then I realized that at least once a week, I needed to build in something that was not news related. And that was completely sort of inadvertent. But what I started to do was, my partner is a lobsterman, but he also takes phenomenal images. So I started putting up his pictures. And people really, really responded to those working man, if you will, pictures. But interestingly enough, shortly after I started sharing those once a week, just by chance, I'd like to sound like I had more of a plan, but I really never did. Just by chance, a friend of mine took this image here, and I wasn't thinking about asking him. You know, I just said, he posted this on Facebook, and I said, oh, Jim, I love that image. Can I use that image? And he didn't hesitate, and he said, oh, yes, I of course, go ahead and use it. And I did, and I didn't even think about the fact that he is, of course, an artist. And here I was asking for the use of his picture without paying him or anything. And I wasn't even thinking, I'm happy to pay him. But he never asked, and then that sort of I sort of woke up and went, crap! I just used a professional photographer's photograph without paying him or anything, just because he was my friend, and then sort of serendipitously, this man contacted me, and we had mutual friends, and he is actually a very, very well-known photographer and a simply lovely man. But an older man who feels a sense of civic duty the way I do. And he contacted me and said, any of the images you want to use from my studio are yours for free, and by the way, I couldn't afford them if I had to pay for them. And I kind of ignored him because I thought, I'm not going to use these. I mean, if you Google him, you will see this is a guy he's an A-lister. And he pushed it, and he finally actually reached out and said, I'm really serious about this. You should go ahead and use my stuff. And so I started using his material, and again, inadvertently picked this after I had done a series on the emotions of what we do. And this picture, Hope, which is actually the name of the child of the man who owns this boat, it's a fishing boat, became a symbol in many ways of the letters. So people have painted me pictures of it. They have done a simply extraordinary wall hanging, all the needlework of it. And I suspect that it will become the cover of a book about the letters at someday. And yes, so that's somebody, Lindsay is putting here that it's to share why sourcing information and providing credit is important. I always credit any of the photographers whose work I borrow, but I don't, if I took a picture myself, I don't credit that. And I have gotten quite angry letters of people saying, you know, you didn't credit whoever this person was. And I'm like, oh, now this is really embarrassing because it was me. And I didn't think it was that good a picture. But every once in a while, I guess I hit the jackpot too. But one of the things that I try and do with the images that you may or may not have noticed if you read them is that when I do some of these photos, there are American flags tucked inside them. Sometimes easy to see, as in this one here on the lower right hand, which is one Buddy took of a lobster fishing boat on the 4th of July. But in the other two images that I'm showing you here, which are virtually black and white, although the one with the lighthouse in it is one by Peter Ralston. He's that well-known photographer. And if you, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but if you look up in the trees, and I can't remember if it's here, my eyes aren't good enough to see it, there is an American flag. And he sent it to me one day, and he said, I want you to use this one, if it works for you this weekend, because I feel like it would really fit right now. And similarly, the one on the right that looks black and white is not black and white. Buddy took it during a storm one day. We were out walking, and it too has an American flag in color in it. And so I work on that pretty carefully. Now, are there questions so far about any of this? Because I'm sort of just feel like I'm running you through this.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're really setting just a wonderful context of the genesis of, I don't even know what to call it. It's not a project, I don't think, or the sort of the initiative that you've taken. And I'm really personally struck by the way that this aligns with what teachers do on a daily basis, as you suggested, meaning, all teachers have curriculum, they have standards to teach or something they need to cover. But in times like these, I guarantee you every one of our audience members has had kids either raise their hand or ask out loud or whatever and try to understand what's going on. And sometimes, all these folks are gatekeepers and they throw the standards down. And for that entire day, they may just sit at the front of the room and just talk about these things that are so disturbing or discombobulating or confusing, regardless of what they teach. And I suspect that also includes non-humanities disciplines. So I personally really find that it's very compelling to hear you set it up that way. I do have one question, though, and that's about audience and tone, I think, because it was wonderful to see the images and the contributions from your readers. Clearly, you now have a sense of the community that you're developing, the personality of what you're writing. What audience do you imagine when you write this? Who are you aiming at when you write these daily letters?
About 6 of my friends, because what I discovered was that it's been such a weird year, because my life has really not changed at all. I am very isolated. I see virtually nobody but my partner, and I sit at my laptop, as I always have done, and I write. And I've always been a letter writer. I write books and stuff as well, but my medium has always been letters. And the weird thing, though, is that I used to write letters to 1 or 2 people, and now I'm writing them to 1 million people a night. And the minute even saying that, you can probably hear me hesitating, because the minute you think this is going out to huge numbers of people, you freeze. So I write to my friends, just to my friends. And if anybody else wants to listen in, that's great. And I'm very careful to recognize, like, every week there will be something will happen, and I'll think, ooh, should I really put that down? And I know some of the people who read me, and they're people that I'm very impressed by. And I think, is that really something I want to put in front of him or her? And then I step back and I say, I'm not writing to them. I'm writing to my college roommate, and she wants to hear this. But I think it's the only way for me to not freeze, to be honest.
Yeah, and that may also then speak to some other questions that have come up about how you identify which of what could be dozens of topics on a daily basis you'd like to write about. Do you largely lean on your own comfort and expertise and background as an historian, or do you try to pick the things that are the most confusing to you?
So that's a great question. And this is one of the places that I think this project has been enormously fun. And that is that, honestly, I started to answer people's questions, but it became very quick, very apparent to me very quickly that what I am doing, and remember, I'm a historian, I am keeping a record of this era, not really even for people today, but for a historian in 100 years. So I literally, every day when I look at the news, and I look at the news from a lot of places, and people write to me now with scoops, with things that they think are important, I literally will look at that news and I will say, what will a historian need to know in 100 years? And so I'm writing for her. And literally, one of my great examples of that is during the election season when Kanye West threatened to start to run for office, and everyone was like, "You got to do this, you got to write this, you got to." And I thought, he doesn't have any fundraising yet. He has not filed. I don't believe that this is even going to make the history books in 100 years as anything other than a footnote. And I never mentioned it. And people were like, how could you not talk about Kanye West? And it's like, to me, that's not a story. The place I really fall down, and you can see me trying to remedy it these days, is I am not a scholar of foreign affairs. And so I underplay that more than I wish I could. I wish I were more informed on things. But for example, when I wrote about the Biden administration recently revealed the report, which by law was supposed to come out of the Trump administration, and they just blew that law off. I actually wrote about that when it happened in 2019. But when they said that, in fact, MBS had been responsible for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, when I wrote about that and talked about the Saudi royal family, I was up for 7 or 8 hours and reading really deeply. Like, I didn't know that MBS was only the third of 4 crown princes he was one of 3 crown princes that the Saudi royal family had had in 4 years. I didn't know that. And so whenever I write about foreign affairs, you have to assume I've been doing, it's a minimum of 8 hours of research for me, because I just don't know it. Like, when I'm doing voting rights, I can kind of do it in my sleep, because I've written books on it. I know who all the scholars are. But, you ask me about the war in Yemen, and literally I start with, okay, where's Yemen? So that's where I fall down. But I'm always writing for the future and as a historical record. And that gives me a really different lens than if I were writing, I think, for today's news, which, you might have noticed, I haven't covered really anything to do with Matt Gaetz yet, because it's not a story yet, right? I mean, it's not a historical story yet. It's he's in trouble story, but we don't know the outcome yet. And so there's a lot of stuff that I kind of fly by because it's not a story yet. And that makes people very angry. I got some really angry emails from people because they felt that I had not spent enough time talking about, one person literally counted up how many times I had said the word George Floyd compared to how many times I had talked about the Atlanta murders. And I wrote back and said, I'm really sorry. I do talk a lot about Asian American history in my books, but this is a record of politics in this era. And right now there has not been a political movement surrounding these murders. Now, 3 days later, there was an organization that stepped up to the plate and talked about organizing Asian Americans even more fully in Georgia than Stacey Abrams already had. People think that she organized African Americans, and she did, but she also organized Asian Americans in Georgia. And I made sure to mention it then for that person. But people get frustrated because they think that this is a chronicle of today's news, and it's not. It's a chronicle of what I think, guessing, some graduate student needs in 100 years.
Right. One last question before I invite you to move on in your slides. This question came a little bit early in the audience chat. Do you have an editor, or do you have somebody who puts eye on this before you hit send?
So that's a great question. I have a copy editor. I don't have an editor. And I wish I did have an editor. I really do. But, when I usually finish it like 3 a.m, people aren't willing to edit then. So what happened was, at about the same time, I guess, and I'm a little fuzzy on this, I would have to go back and check my notes, 2 women whom I've never met before, one of whom used to be an accountant, and the other one of whom, I don't know what she was. Neither one of them employed outside the home now. Both older, I think. I've never either met or seen pictures of either. Started writing to me and started, I guess one of them must have complained about something that had gone wrong with copy editing. And by the way, I used to edit a magazine, so I'm really good at copy editing myself, but it's hard to see your own errors. And I suck at commas. I totally suck at commas. And so I guess actually one of them, I think, used to send me stories, and somehow they got together, obviously through me, probably on the Facebook chats. And so they sort of made themselves my team. And somehow or other, I started sending the columns when I finished them for copy editing to this woman who's just terrific, especially with commas. And she has ever since then, she hasn't missed a single night, even if it's 4 o'clock in the morning. Actually, that's not true. I guess there was one where it's 5 o'clock in the morning. I said, please go to bed. because I'm so frustrated. Just go to bed. But she, after she'd done it for about 2 weeks, I said, I need to pay you. And she got very unhappy. And she said, the minute I start taking money will be the minute I never want to do it again. So yes. Now, the other woman doesn't edit at all. But every time I finish something, I think it sucks. I think it's terrible. And so now I send them to both of them, and she responds to me. You're going to see I've got a comment from her. She will say to me, she will literally say, this isn't any good. You need to write this again. Or this is much better than you think it is. And she's got a much better eye than I do for what is for what people are going to like, because very, very often I will say, this sucks so badly, I can't even put it. I can't. In fact, this happened just last week. One of the things actually that Andy wanted me to talk about today was a letter that I thought was so bad. I wrote a second letter that night because the first one was so bad. And I sent it to these women, and the one I was just telling you about said, I don't like it. I don't think it's salvageable either. And the other woman said, I think you cut it by a third and it's going to be good. But I'd already written a second one. So this is Friday of last week, and I did. I cut it by a third, and then I cut it a little bit more, and it's been one of my most popular. And then Saturday I posted a picture, and then Sunday I posted the other one, and that one too has been enormously popular. But if you look, you'll see that on Friday night of last week, I think I posted at 5 a.m. because I wrote 2 that night. Anyway, I don't have official editors. And the first one never actually edits, but she will say, yes, this is bad, or no, this is really good, or and the other one does my copy editing, and she's very, very good. She's very good. So yes, now I have somebody. You'll see there were errors at the start, but there usually aren't any longer.
Fantastic. We do have some other questions, but I'm going to ask you to move forward, and I'll bring them forward in a little bit.
Okay, so one of the things that was interesting to me was thinking about, well, first of all, I'm sorry, here's a different one I forgot about. People tend to forget that I did have a little bit of background doing this. And in fact, when I say people, I mean me. I had, in fact, done 2 posts on my Facebook page that had gone viral in 2016 and 2017. So in 2016, you probably don't remember this, but Charlie Kirk got his start. He now runs Turning Point USA, but he got his start in November of 2016, starting something called the Professor Watch List. And it was really, to my eye, just a grift. He was looking for money. And it was a very simple website shortly after the election, and he put names on it, and he put my name on it, having taken me, I think, from another watch list that I was on, which was totally stupid. I had written an article about Abraham Lincoln for Cobblestone, if you know that magazine, and it was pretty anodyne. I mean, it was, this is what Lincoln did sort of thing, and I ended up on some watch list. It's called the Terminate list, which obviously had a dual meaning. They meant they were going to get me fired from my job, but it was uncomfortable enough that somebody from the Southern Poverty Law Center, I think it was, called me and said, you need to know you're on this list. Anyway, nothing ever came of it. That wasn't important, but I think he was just looking for the names of any professors, since I don't think he'd gone to college himself, but he put my name on it, and I didn't react at all because I was used to hate mail and that kind of crap and stuff. But I came down that morning for breakfast, and my house was very dark at the time, and I remember standing at the counter, and my email and my Facebook page and everything were being flooded with people going, oh my God, we've got your back. And I'm thinking, is this not normal? Do other people not get hate mail and stuff like this? And it shocked me, not that he had done it, but that everybody else was so shocked. And to make people feel better, I wrote a post saying, relax, this is who I am. This is what I stand for, and this is why this man is going after me. And it got picked up by Bill Moyers. I think that's the first thing I ever had on Bill Moyers' website, and it went viral. And they took me off the watch list the next day. And if anybody's interested, I think I called that up. I can read it to you. But it basically said, this is why I care so deeply about America. And don't worry about me. Everyone said, please don't stop talking. And I said, the final line was, don't worry, I will not shut up. America is still worth fighting for. And then after Trump was elected, when he did the travel ban in January of 2017, I wrote a Facebook post saying, before you're all freaking out about this, this is what I call the shock event. I had never read Naomi Klein, by the way. I actually took that concept from my work with Indigenous history and what happened when the diseases in the virgin soil population wiped out so many people and destabilized their economies, societies, and religions. And I said, this is what's going on, and what they're doing is they're creating chaos, but please remember that chaos is a time when you can wreak havoc and become a dictator. It is also a time when all the cards are up in the air and we can create an entirely new society. And that sucker totally went viral. I went out to dinner that night with my partner, and actually I was waiting for him. We didn't live together at the time. I was waiting for him to come pick me up. And so I wrote this Facebook post. And when I came back home, that night had been shared like, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of times. And that became a really huge deal. So I did kind of have a history of writing these sort of letters to my friends and having them go viral. So, and people tend to forget that I'm the person who wrote the shock event post. But then I tried to think for Andy about what the letters might do, because I still don't really know what their magic sauce is. And that's why I say I only write for my friends. I'm not going to change that, because I think the minute I try to make things better for meeting this huge audience I now have, I'm going to ruin it. So one of the things that I try and do every day is to take a look at what happened for the day and to step back and make sense historically of what happened. So I will tell you that I expect tonight to write about voter suppression, but to write about voter suppression in the sense of how what is happening right now in Georgia compares to what happened during Reconstruction, and to focus on the rise of the New South and how the New South doesn't really manage to rise, because every time that workers try to have a piece of the pie, they get shut down and their vote gets taken away from them. So I always try and step back and say, how do I make sense of all this? And I can't actually see the pieces that I stole. Actually, you know what? I'll look over here. I can read this to you. I actually, what's on the slide in front of you is me looking for patterns. And this is November 12, 2019. And I wrote on that day, I have spent the day madly checking footnotes and making final corrections on the manuscript of my forthcoming book. And I emerged at about 8 o'clock to look at the news. It hit like a fire hose. We have separated almost 70,000 children from their parents under the Trump administration. White House advisor Stephen Miller wrote more than 900 emails to a Breitbart reporter advocating white nationalism. Turkey's President Erdogan, the dictator whose troops allegedly committed war crimes when they pushed into northern Syria last month, is visiting the White House tomorrow. Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort's associate Rick Gates said at Trump advisor Roger Stone's trial for lying to Congress that Trump knew about the WikiLeaks dumps of DNC mails that had been done by Russia. The Department of Justice is trying to finish a report on the attacks on the 2016 election before Attorney General William Barr presents the alternative one he's working on with John Durham. And I deliberately put all those in a mess together. And then there's a space and it says, and I thought, how on earth will I ever make sense of this tonight? And then I said, and then I hit upon a Washington Post article outlining the different approaches Democrats and Republicans are taking toward the public impeachment testimony that starts tomorrow. Democrats want a serious and somber process, this is a quote, of publicly exposing Trump's misconduct, narrated by career diplomats who were alarmed by the president's push to have Ukraine investigate former Vice President Joe Biden and his son. as well as a debunked theory concerning the 2016 election in exchange for military aid and a White House visit coveted by Ukraine's new leader. Meanwhile, Republicans prepared to fervently defend Trump while painting the impeachment probe as a thinly veiled show trial designed to take down a president who did nothing wrong. And then I go on to say, and then it hit me. The story for tonight, and indeed for this administration, and for the last several years of the once great Republican Party, is clear. The people in charge of this country right now have abandoned democracy. And then it goes on to talk from then on about that. And so always behind the patterns that I try and pull together is this constant hammering of the defense of American democracy, which is why I called it Letters from an American. That harks back both to Crevecoeur's Letters from an American Farmer at the beginning of the Republic, when he's talking about what it means to be an American, and of Letters from America, Alistair Cook's British version of looking at America during World War II and immediately afterward, especially. So there's the patterns behind the news, and there is. Would this be a good time to talk about how we could use that in a classroom, or do you want me to keep on going?
It certainly can be, and we've got some questions that are bubbling up around that. And in fact, maybe I'll just interject this one question and we can move on. You hear a lot from your audience, largely in positive ways, it sounds like, although I suspect you get plenty of not so nice feedback. Have you ever heard, Professor, from educators about the ways they might use your Letters from an American in their classroom?
Yes, people ask me a lot for the set pieces, if you will. So I try and put, not infrequently, and I wish I had a better description for you than that, a piece about some event in America that pulls on larger themes. So, for example, the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, that one went far. The recent one I did on Selma, on the Selma March, the history behind that one went far. And many of them actually are used in other countries, those, because they're short, relatively short. And when I do a set piece like that, I try and keep them under 800 words. I couldn't do that for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but the trick to them, I think, is that they take pretty tight factual information. So I never try I always try and make sure every word counts. So it jumps right into events or history or facts, something to sink your teeth into. But then it ties it to this larger story of American democracy. And that's really, really quite deliberate. But you will see one of the things that I have a hard time with in the letters, my books are not like this, but in the letters, is making sure that we have enough representation of non-white, non-male Americans. And one of the problems is when you're talking about government, until very recently, you were largely talking about white men. And I see that as a real weakness of the letters. But all I can do is push people toward the books, which is where I, can move into different realms. And I work really hard at trying to make sure I'm including other voices. And even still, my favorite stories don't get told. I do manage to work Indigenous people in a lot, but when was the last time I really did an entire piece on, even Asian history? I wrote a whole piece the other day on Asian history, Asian American history, and I never found a place for it. Yeah.
Great. But part of my job as the moderator is to keep us on time as well. We've got about a half an hour, so why don't we move forward, and I'll continue to mine the chat box for comments and questions.
Terrific. So I look for patterns behind the news. I also look for explaining things that, and as I say, this used to drive me bonkers when I was watching the TV news or reading newspapers. And my great example of this is the Logan Act. In the previous administration, you may remember that Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton went ahead and authored a piece he wrote to Iran in which he said, don't pay any attention to Obama, we're going to take the White House, and when we do that, we're going to change everything. And all of a sudden, the newspapers and the TV news were talking about, he's violated the Logan Act. And I'm like, what the heck is the Logan Act? I've taught American history for 30 years. I've never heard of the Logan Act. And then I looked it up and I'm like, well, that's easy. Why didn't they just explain what the Logan Act was? So a lot of what the letters do is they explain every single term. You will notice it was probably after he was elected that I stopped explaining who Joe Biden was, because I want somebody who knows nothing to be able to pick these up. And so, for example, I've shown you here an explanation for who the Gang of Eight is. People always talk about the Gang of Eight, and they don't explain who they were. It's an informal name for the 8 leaders who must be briefed on classified issues. They're the leaders of each major party in each house. So Nancy Pelosi, Kevin McCarthy from the House, Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer in the Senate, and then the top members of each party from the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. So putting down what those things are, or for example, people would ask me questions like, how is it that Trump's approval ratings are higher than ever before? And then I explain how presidents get bumps. And so that's one of the things I always try and do, is make sure I explain absolutely everything, because I hate being in a classroom and everybody is talking and you have no idea what they're talking about. And I swear all my career has ever been is me saying, I don't understand that. Can you please explain it? And then you discover nobody else understands it either. They're just pretending they do.
Professor, I'm sorry to interrupt you. This I'd like to share this question from Carl. Carl's a great English teacher in Radnor High School in Pennsylvania, and he's noting that we all often talk about the relationship between skills and knowledge. And it sounds like your process, as you've just described in the explanation slide, depends on knowledge. That is to say, recognizing potential patterns and connections out of your own knowledge. How do you think in this age of Google we live in, do you suggest that we can position the value of knowing in addition to the value of researching and seeking?
Well, that's a hard question, Carl, because of I think one of the reasons that I know things is because I'm 58 years old and I've been studying it for 30 years. So I can look, for example, tonight at the fact that Coca-Cola has come out against the voter suppression rules in Georgia, and I can sit there and say, ooh, that reminds me of the attempt in the South in the 1880s and the 1890s to create the New South. But I wouldn't have known that 30 years ago. It's that I have been there. One of the things that I tell my students, though, is to fall in love with something. And I say, I don't care what it is. Like, if you follow baseball, that's great. And when you watch a baseball team, you have a pretty good sense of who's doing well and who's not, because you can sit there and you can say, well, so-and-so's got a pulled hamstring. You tell me someone's got a pulled hamstring, I'll be like, I don't even know who that person is. But if you recognize that there are connections and that you need to pull at those strings and compare it to, in this case, the idea of really knowing some subject well, music or sailing or, whatever, that at least gives them an understanding of deep knowledge. But I do think it's not an accident that it's an older person who is able to make these sorts of connections. The other thing that I think is important about the letters and what they stand for is that people always say to me, how do you know so much? I'm like, I don't know that much, but I know where to look. And that's something that we do as teachers, is to say, if you want to know about the Carlisle Indian School, let's think about where you could look for information about that. And that's one of the things I really emphasize when people do say to me, how do you know this stuff? It's like, I don't know this stuff. I know where to look. And that's what you need nowadays, I think, with the internet, is to know where to go. And that's all I bring to the table.
And actually, it's interesting that Jennifer, who's joining us from Los Angeles, just asked the same thing, which is, and she may have been asking it a little bit hypothetically, but I'll bring it to you. If you have no idea where to start, where do you start? How do you? Where are some of your? Can you make visible for us some of your first go-to sources?
Well, again, for me, it's easy for me because I know where the stuff is. So I know who the good writers are on foreign affairs or whatever. But I think you're asking about students. And students, it's the same thing, really, right? So you want them to know, and I can't speak for anything but history, But where to send, believe me, if you're asking me where to send students for information about physics, we're all going to end up with our bridges falling apart. But what I say to them is I start with reputable places like libraries, like library websites, like librarians, and also I always tell them, believe it or not, that it's okay to start with Wikipedia to at least give them a lay of the land, and then we jump right down to the bibliographies and take a look at how good those bibliographies are. And what I always tell them is that, and I tell them not to start with secondary sources for college students because you don't have any way of knowing if a secondary source is reputable when you just sort of pull it off the shelf. But you do know if you go in through libraries or start with newspapers and primary sources, for example, you start to know what you think. And that's how I start students off. But of course, I have students who are more sophisticated than grade school students that I assume are the ones that you're starting with to learn about things. So I actually do kind of reinforce the idea of gatekeepers, and I mean gatekeepers as in librarians and national museums, places that are reputable, rather than modern day newspapers. When I say newspapers, I don't mean I'm sorry, I should have specified that. I mean historical newspapers. I'd never send people to today's newspapers, students to today's newspapers, unless I've vetted them first.
Interesting, thank you. Why don't we move forward, and then we'll circle back momentarily.
Good. So I try and always give people explanations. I always try and approach things with skepticism, which makes me unpopular sometimes, but here was a great example of this, speaking of knowing people. And this was on January 8th, 2020, when the Boeing 37 that was carrying 180 Ukrainians crashed near Tehran shortly after it took off. You may remember that was hit with a missile, but we didn't know that when I wrote. And I said, first reports say it suffered mechanical failure, we'll see. And obviously it was not the case, it was shot down. Immediately thereafter, 2 earthquakes hit Iran. Now you may not remember this, but that night the news was chock full of Iran has tested a nuclear weapon. And I heard these things all happening, and I thought, maybe, but let's wait. It's like that old thing about technology. Anybody who wants you to do something instantly is probably trying to steal something from you. So I thought, let's wait. And I thought, okay, earthquakes, how do I find out about this? And I thought, well, I'll call a seismologist. And that's exactly what I did. And because I work at a university, and the seismologist I didn't call, I wrote an email, said, no, not a chance. And I said, how do you know? And he said, because we watched the seismology, the whatever they are, the seismographers, that's not the word, but whatever it is that bounces along with the earth, we watch that constantly. We literally have one in our office. So I said, but yeah, how can you tell the difference between a nuclear test and an earthquake? And he obviously thought I was an idiot. And he said, because they're nuclear tests all the time. I'm like, really? He's like, yes, they're nuclear tests all the time, and they're much deeper than earthquakes. They have an entirely different pattern. And I'm sorry, nuclear tests are shallower than earthquakes. They have an entirely different pattern, and we absolutely can read the patterns. And I promise you, this was an earthquake. And so that's what I wrote. And of course, that's exactly what it was. And you never heard another peep about it. But if you were watching the news that night, you thought that Iran had tested a nuclear weapon. So I try and bring skepticism, and I try to bring humor to the letters as well when I can. There's not a lot that's very funny that goes on, but there is occasionally stuff that jumps out. So there's a long-running joke in the letters about the fact that every time I mentioned Devin Nunes, I always pointed out that he took money from Lev Parnas, a Ukrainian operative, Lev Parnas, and on did I miss one? I missed one. I'm sorry, before I get to humor, I always try to hit on patriotism, to redefine patriotism as what I believe in, which is a multicultural democracy. And so I hit on that again and again and again. And it turned out when I looked back over this for Andy that I had done this as early as December 31st, 2019. So just 3 months after I started writing, in which I said, and I've said this 1,000 different ways ever since, American democracy has never been perfect. And of late voices, many of those of Russian bots, have dismissed it as a sham. On the one hand, naysayers insist that our country is broken because we have given too much power to minorities, women, and the poor. Those people, this argument goes, vote for Democrats who will give them handouts, programs that redistribute tax dollars from hardworking white men to their own pockets. Those who back this argument want to keep those people from voting through voter suppression measures or with underrepresenting them in Congress through gerrymandering laws. On the other hand, voices attack democracy because we have never really allowed full rights to any but white men. Democracy was never real and will never be real, they say. So what's the point in fighting for it? But see, here's the thing. Once you give up the principle of equality before the law, you have given up the whole game. You have admitted the principle that people are unequal and that some people are better than others. Once you have replaced the principle of equality with the idea that humans are unequal, you have granted your approval to the idea of rulers and servants. At that point, all you can do is to hope that no one in power decides that you belong in one of the lesser groups. And I hope that the educators here recognize that. That is obviously channeling Abraham Lincoln. And I did that very deliberately, and Lincoln shows up a lot. All right, so then, as I say, I try always to include humor. And so I was writing about Ron DeSantis, who took money, Russian money, from indicted political operative Lev Parnas. And then I had a asterisk saying, I'm totally not making that up. That was in March. And then, of course, the other thing that I think has made the letters really take off is that I always cite all of my sources, except my history sources. If it's my own material, I tend not to cite them because that just feels weird to me. But if it is in the letters, it is cited. And that people really appreciate, although it has driven me insane because the servers reject the Substack letters pretty frequently because they think they're spam, because so many of the sources actually carry advertising with them. So I basically have a team of people virtually full-time overriding the spam filters so that things go through. And finally, I, of course, always try to emphasize history. And some of the most popular things I have written are ones that simply do overviews of history. And so I pulled these three. On December 30th, this was a piece that I posted at 5:10 a.m. because I hated it so much. I was ready not to do it. I told both of my friends to go to bed, that I wasn't going to post. And then I'm like, I can't, excuse me. And I'm sorry for the profanity, but I said to myself, damn it, I can't not write it. It's already 4 o'clock in the morning. I'm going to finish it. So I just powered on through it. I gritted my teeth. I said, it's horrible. I don't care. I'm just going to post it. I hit it at 5:10 a.m. It was way too long. It came in over 2,200 words. Nothing else has ever been more than 14, and I aim for 12. And it has been seen at this point more than 4 million times. So it turned out that ended up being popular. And then just last week, those two pieces that I hated so thoroughly on March 16th, 26th and 28th, also drew in history and also were very popular. So I wanted to leave you here, and then I will take questions, with what I always strive for, because the woman that I mentioned before who reads it to tell me whether or not it's as bad as I think it is, whenever I've done good, whenever it's good, she often says, oh, it's fine, it's good. Yeah, this is fine, this one's good, this one's solid, this is okay, people will like this, whatever. She sends me maybe 3 sentences on my Facebook messaging. But if I've done really well, if I've really nailed it, this is what she writes. Good stuff, Maynard. I have no idea where that came from. But when I get a good stuff, Maynard, I know it's going places. And I got a Good Stuff Maynard last week for March 28th, although I had to laugh when I put this up here because she wrote, "Good stuff, Maynard. Love these history pieces, and this is a great one." And then she wrote, "Send the last graph." And I thought, you want another paragraph? So I wrote the other paragraph, and she was right. It needed another paragraph. And I often send it to them without the final paragraph because I'm still working on it. So she assumed that I had to send another paragraph. And when she wrote that, I did. I wrote another paragraph. So that is the story behind the letters. And I am perfectly happy to address this or any other questions. But you will know, I think, when she says, "Good stuff, Maynard," I've hit it. And that happens maybe every 2 weeks, but probably more like once a month.
Thank you for sharing that storyline. I'm going to be interested to see how many of our audience members use that maybe when they're grading their papers or giving some formative feedback to their students. We've got some time for questions, folks. Please do ask formal questions in the Ask Professor Richardson tab, or you can just drop them in the audience chat and we'll bring them forward. I'm going to start with a question and then we'll give folks a time to add what's on their mind. Professor, can I noticed that recently, and I apologize, I don't know when you started this, but relatively recently you've started to do a regular, if not daily, video stream on Facebook where you're responding and talking. So now you've actually shared this in 3 different formats, right? You've got the video on Facebook, the text, of course, with Letters from America, an American, and now this audio format that you're joining us with tonight. How is it different to work in these 3 different mediums? Do you find it different to speak or be seen or be interviewed than you do just to write to your 6 friends?
So that's a really good question. And I do think this is actually quite important for educators because this is something I'm really playing with as you're going to all learn fairly soon. I actually really like the different media, and I use them all very differently. So the whole Facebook thing had nothing to do with the letters. Literally, I had learned to use Zoom because of the pandemic, and I recognized that a lot of my readers were probably going to be stuck at home, and I thought, I'll just keep them company. I literally thought that maybe I should go ahead and read books to people. I mean, I didn't know what I was going to do, and I sort of floated this idea because I had a book coming out, and I was supposed to be all over the country advertising it, which I actually don't. My schedule was brutal, and I said to my publicist, because coronavirus had just hit, and I said, why don't I just talk to people? And maybe they'll buy books. But I really didn't care because the letters. I was doing everything with the letters, and I wasn't convinced the book was great anyway. So she said, sure, let's try it. Let's see if people want it. So I said, okay, I'll go ahead and do a live thing on Facebook, and the response completely floored me. There were like 70,000 people watching it, and I'm like, what the heck just happened here? And that's why there are 2 of them, is because people were like, we need different times and we need different subjects and all that. So the Facebook videos were only to entertain people. They were seriously only to entertain people. And so I started taking political questions at one of them, and the other one was in the middle of the day because I figured maybe people would be homeschooling and I could talk about history and people could homeschool through that. So those have their own. Those actually have with a letter, which are completely standalones. But there's also, I'm on Twitter, and I used to do Twitter threads, some of which were very good. Now I just try and amplify other voices because there isn't enough of me to go around. And I'm also on Instagram. And on Instagram, I only post sort of nature pictures or fun pictures or whatever. And that frustrates people sometimes. They're like, why don't you put your letters over here? And I'm like, because the point is not for me to advertise the letters. I never advertise the letters. The point is to demonstrate what it looks like to be a member of a democracy and to have interests outside of my job. So yeah, here's a picture of me kayaking, not me, but of kayaking when I'm out on the water, because I'm actually a whole person. I'm not just somebody who works or teaches or writes letters or whatever. I'm a full person. And I actually think that all those different media, and of course interviews are different entirely because they're other driven. So are radio. I do a lot of radio. Actually, really love radio. That's my favorite medium. But they're all reaching different audiences in different ways. And if I had time, I'd do TikTok as well. And I just so far haven't had time to do that. But I think that it's not just that you're reaching different audiences. It's that if you're functioning in different media, you are presenting a different picture of what it means to operate in society. And I actually really enjoy that. I enjoy all the different media.
That's a great question. I'm going to take a question that was submitted a little bit earlier from our friend Lori about social media specifically. I'm going to apply her question, I think, to where you just concluded your thoughts. In some ways, social media and your embrace of different kinds of social media platforms is at the heart of what you're sharing tonight. She's curious, and I wonder if you can maybe splice those two ideas together. She's curious if you think that same social media has actually been destructive in the ways that we've communicated, the ways that politicians and news organizations have represented realities and perspectives. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts in terms of the concept of writing and researching concise letters. And you can even, as I ask that question, imagine doing it by pen and hand versus tweets and TikToks and these other kinds of ephemeral ways to communicate. What's the negative side of that?
Well, so they're all tools. Everything is just a tool. And right now, the reason that I write on Facebook, and almost nobody else does, by the way, although more people are doing it now, is because of the disinformation there. I am deliberately there. I actually, it takes a significant effort to do what I do. And I give it away for free on Facebook. And I do that because I care about America. And I do that there because when I was really starting to write a lot, it was inundated with Russian bots. And I was determined to try and take that space back. So you may have noticed that the chat by my Facebook is also pretty well curated, and that I literally have a full-time moderator who goes in and zaps the crap. The people who are, the bots who are hitting on people, and all the crap that makes you not want to participate in a public discussion, because I'm trying to model the idea of what a public discussion looks like. That being said, social media has incredible potential to do good. It also does an incredible amount of bad. And I always liken it, perhaps somewhat frivolously, to the Wild West in mythology. And that is that there are a lot of really bad actors out there, and we need to bring social media under control. And don't think for a minute that we can't do that. The problem is there has not been the social will to do that until now. And once we have done that, I actually think it's got enormous potential to break down barriers, not only internally, domestically, but also internationally, because people are reaching across lines. But it's like any other major technology, industrialization, fire, the wheel. You were going to have to go ahead and figure out how to use that technology so that it serves us rather than we serve it. And that's not going to be easy. There's a wonderful piece on my We're History website by a man named Michael Sokolow, in which he talks about the commodification of viewers, of people who consume media. And it's a really important piece because he breaks down how advertising actually sells us. We think people are selling products to us, but in fact, it's the other way around. The media is selling us as a product to the advertisers. And that's exactly what's happened with social media. And that's a terrible thing. And it, to my mind, it simply must be regulated. So that's a really important point, I think.
Great, thank you. Talk to us a little bit about the ways that your colleagues in the field, in the discipline of history, have responded to your work. And I don't necessarily mean colleagues at your home university, but all the historians that you are colleagues with, you go to conferences with, you went to grad school with. How have they responded to the work that you're doing?
I really can't answer that. Remember, I haven't seen anybody in a year because I hate to say it sounds really weird, but when we do get together, we're on Zoom and we're talking about work, And nobody wants to Zoom for anything other than work because we're on this stupid platform all the time. So we really haven't talked about it much and what this means and what it looks like. I do think that what interests me about this, and one of the reasons I love so much to talk to educators, is I think education's changing dramatically. And the new platforms we have are going to feed into that. But I have no idea how. And that's when I have conversations with people now about what's happened with me and all that, is what I really try and hammer on is, what is this going to look like for classrooms or not? I mean, how does this mean we're going to be able to, one of the populations that'd be great to reach better is incarcerated juveniles, especially the ones who are in temporarily and get knocked out of their classrooms so that they lose traction with their classes. Will this enable us to help that population get better educations? Or what about people, who are not in places where they can have access to languages, for example? Will this enable us to do that better? Or will it mean that that it breaks down our unions, for example, to the point that we lose the traction that we've already gotten in education? And I don't know the answer to that, but I do think this is something we must grapple with going forward at all levels of American education.
Thank you. This question is from Lindsay. She's wondering if there has been a particular question or topic that's come to you over the course of the last year or so that's really surprised you, that has caught you off guard.
Not off the top of my head, but I will tell you, Lindsay, one of the things that is I don't know if it's the last year or that I'm trying to do so much, my memory for the things I write is like the goldfish. Like literally, when I was walking up here tonight to do this, I couldn't remember what I wrote about last night. So it's entirely possible people have asked me things. I get hundreds of questions every day that are really terrific. And people have put me onto wonderful stuff, but I don't remember anything that was a particular surprise. I do note that one of the things that people complain about, I think with great justice, is that I've never written about religion and how I have managed. I've written about evangelical voters, but I've never written about American religion. And people complain about that, and they're dead right. And it's something I'm going to have to make sure I write about in the future. But I don't remember a surprise. I'm sure there was one.
And similarly, there's a question, and I'm going to take us back to slide one just as a visual representation. There is a question about what you think might be one of the most important themes or topics that you will be addressing in the coming amount of time. I know it's hard to predict what's coming next, and I don't necessarily want you to choose voting rights versus, social justice versus pandemic, but maybe you can. Like, what's the thing that we really have to be concerned about at this point?
Well, aside from climate change, which is just remarkably hard to write about, just FYI, because again, one of the things that makes writing compelling is being able to grab hold of specific things you can drop on your feet, if you will. And climate change is much harder to do that with. My sister, by the way, is a prominent climate scientist, so I'm not unaware of that, and it's really never made it in the letters. But aside from that, the story of the present is voting rights, because everything else comes down to that: who's going to be in control of the country and who is represented and who is not. And I had not planned to continue these for a long period of time. I didn't really have a plan to end them, but I also didn't have a plan to continue them. But it is clear to me now, after the insurrection of January 6th, that we're not out of the woods yet as a democracy by a long shot. And I think for at least the next 2 years, the question of who's going to control our government is the most potent one, and the one that wraps everything else into it. I mean, all the other movements matter, but they all come down to who's going to have a say in society. And that, at the end of the day, comes down to what I've always cared about so deeply, is American democracy, and whether or not it can, in fact, long endure, as Lincoln said. And in a way, I sort of feel like I'm just an observer from his time put forward in the present to say, can you people make this democracy work as a multicultural, multi-gendered, multi-everything procedure, or are we going to devolve into an oligarchy? And I wish that the answer were clearer than it seems to be right now. I will say, so I saw somebody in the chat, somebody said, am I concerned about the future of the country? I got to tell you, yeah, of course. I mean, I don't put these kind of hours in because this is my idea of fun, although it is kind of, I do like to write, but I'd rather be writing about history. But I am more hopeful now than I have been in my career because people are finally paying attention. And I wouldn't be writing these letters if I thought that there was not a hope for the future. And I promise you that the day that I am stopped, not the day that I stop, because someday I will stop, but the day that I am stopped is the day that you know you have lost democracy. So I think that's really the story going forward is, can we protect American democracy?
Great, thank you. Last question tonight, Professor. As an historian, you know, we have a lot of history teachers in the room tonight. Not all, but we have quite a few. And I suspect that many students enter their K-12 education and leave it saying that they don't like history and it's the boring subject, et cetera. Talk to us a little bit about how historians like yourself or those who study history are uniquely positioned to make comments and to have this kind of commentary, this kind of informed commentary. All the other disciplines also contribute, but what about history itself as a discipline is uniquely positioned to help us through this?
Well, what historians do is they study how and why society changes. And one of the things that of course, then that you're doing when you look at history is taking a look at what you think changes the world. Is it great men? Is it religion? Is it popular movements? Is it the economy? Is it environment? You know, what causes change? And I always tell students that, you know, every time they buy a product, you know, choose a kind of toothpaste, someday put their kids in preschool, and certainly vote, they are making a decision about how they think the world changes. But I think one of the things that makes that interesting, to me anyway, is that, first of all, I love the stories about the past, but that we somehow have this idea that people in the past were either villains or heroes. And that all history is all of us making everyday decisions about what we're going to do next. And what's so magical about history and so gripping about history is that it's created by ordinary people making decisions about what next step they're going to take. And so one of the things I like to talk about a lot is people that we think of as heroes, but they didn't wake up in the morning to be heroes. They woke up in the morning just to get through the day. And I talk a lot about how, you know, nobody wakes up in the morning and says, oh, today I'm going to be horrible. They always wake up and say, today I'm going to make the world a better place, unless they're a sociopath. But for many people, that literally then means they're going to go kill someone. So you want to get into the idea of what drives human beings. But one of my favorite stories is the story that is written about in a book called Angels of the Underground, and it's 4 women who became leaders of the resistance movement in the Philippines during World War II. And I love that book. And I'm going to give you a spoiler here, because none of those women set out to become heroes at all. Like literally one of them becomes a spy because when they are supposed to be rounded up to be registered by the Japanese, they're all supposed to show up at this restaurant. And then the Japanese tell them they're going to be able to go home again. And she goes to the restaurant and she has a panic attack. And so she can't be there. And she's like, I don't care, I'm going home. And her friends are all like, no, just stay till you're registered and then you can go home. And she's like, no, I can't. She's having a panic attack. She goes home. And of course, everybody else gets rounded up and moved out. And there she is in her apartment. And she ends up hiding for weeks and observing everything that the Japanese soldiers are doing in this dark apartment because she had a panic attack. Not because she was any hero. And they were all like that. And one of the things that I find so compelling about history is the fact that it really comes down to all of us as individuals and what the next step is that we take every time. And so for me, that's what brings it all alive, is looking, for example, at this woman who had a panic attack, but then went on to use her knowledge. Or Sitting Bull, who recognized that the walls were closing in around him, but by God, he was going to do the next right thing. And he did, right up until he was killed. So for me, that's what keeps me in the chair and helps me keep my students in the chair, I think.
Heather, thank you for keeping us in our chairs tonight. This is a fantastic webinar. We really do appreciate your insights and look forward to continuing to get your newsletters. If you do it like Betty, 38 years, that's 2059. We'll expect those in our morning email boxes.
Don't hold your breath.
I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. It's been a fascinating webinar. I hope it's helpful for you in the way that you approach your daily conversations with your students. I do encourage you to sign up to receive the daily missive letters from an American. Please also follow the National Humanities Center social media feeds for upcoming opportunities. That does include the application process for the Teacher Advisory Council. Again, we'll be accepting those applications until May the 3rd. Our next session is scheduled for April the 6th, next Tuesday night. I'll be joined by past NHC fellow Heather Williams. She's a professor of Africana Studies at University of Pennsylvania. Heather's going to be working with us and discussing her recent research on genealogy in the enslaved in a session titled Help Me Find My People. Please do have a great spring break if it's this week, a great spring break if it's next. Enjoy your Easter weekend. We look forward to seeing you again at the next Humanities in Class webinar. Have a great day at school tomorrow or the next time you're in the classroom. Good night, everyone.